Hi everyone, it's Chris. Welcome to Firms Consulting channel. And today we're going to talk about how to manage travel expenses if you are a management consultant. This is an important question to consider because mismanagement of travel expenses can be detrimental to your reputation within the firm and to your consulting career. Your project manager and other colleagues will in meaningful way contribute to the decisions on which travel expenses are relevant and appropriate, but at the end of the day, you are completely responsible for the decisions related to travel expenses. Your choices must rest on a foundation of clarity and sensibility. No one should even think about questioning your expenses. Hence, gaining a clear-eyed perspective on how to manage travel expenses on consulting projects will help you prepare to succeed. This video is inspired by a question from a Firms Consulting reader who is a Deloitte consultant in the United States. And this Deloitte consultant wanted to know how to determine if travel expenses, for example, bills related to hotel stay, restaurants, taxi, during a consulting project are reasonable and appropriate. And he has given examples from his recent consulting project. So here are examples. A management consultant chooses a flight or hotel which allows him to collect reward points, even though an equivalent alternative is much cheaper. Example 2. A management consultant visits a luxury spa and charges it to the client. This charge is included in an aggregate bill, so the client cannot see the itemized charge to the luxury spa. Example 3. The engagement team stays at a 5-star hotel even though the Deloitte consultant feels he does not need the lifestyle. And example 4. The engagement team enjoys expensive dinners at a luxury hotel which are not necessary. So the Deloitte consultant expressed the following concern. This doesn't seem to be in the client's best interest, he says. It appears to be unethical. How do you ensure these practices are curbed? And how does the junior consultant decide what is ethical or not in the above scenario and act accordingly in team settings? This is a great set of questions to begin with. I am going to give you a set of guidelines that you can use to manage your travel expenses and to determine if certain expense is appropriate or not appropriate. But before we talk about guidelines on how to manage travel expenses, I want to give you 2 real examples of how travel expenses were mismanaged. The first example is from Michael's career from the days when he was a management consultant. And unless you are completely new to Firms Consulting, you will know that Michael is one of the partners who prepares content for our members and our community. So back to my story. When Michael just joined the firm, which was a really long time ago, his firm just recently finished a major turnaround engagement for a major oil company. That oil company was just about to lose its biggest client, and they hired Michael's firm to figure out how to replace that revenue stream. The project was very successful. The client was very impressed with the work done, but there was an issue with the project. A presentation was put up by a senior partner which covered the feedback from the client. And one of the things that the client said is that while they would not hesitate to recommend the firm for the analytical skills, what they didn't like is that they felt the firm was not cognizant of what the client was going through. The client disliked that the team ran up expensive bills in the restaurants in the town where the client's head office was located, knowing full well at the time that people were being retrenched. And this came directly from the CEO. This is CEO of a major oil company giving a major consulting firm a feedback like that, telling them he loved the work, but he did not thought that travel expenses were handled well. And while they were most likely to use the firm again, it just leaves him with a bad feeling that the travel expenses were abused. And another example involves Firms Consulting. We once hired a team to do some significant work for us. We flew them down and booked them in a hotel, covering all their expenses, including setting up a nice team dinner at a prominent restaurant. And when we were doing the travel expenses later, we came across a statement describing basically them going to a nightclub and the charges that they incurred there and the drinks and so on. This situation still upsets me because we did not ask them to go to a nightclub. They chose to do it and they decided to bill us for it. We paid it, but we never worked with them again and we would never recommend them to anybody. They lost a major client over a relatively minor expense. They contact us often for work and can never understand that trust has been broken. These two incidents serve as a framing point for the structure I'm going to give you to help you manage travel expenses. When thinking about whether the behavior or travel expenses are appropriate, you need to think about it from the firm's perspective, from the client's perspective, and from your perspective. And you need to consider three elements: cost, perception, and value. Imagine a 3x3 matrix here. On one side you have yourself, the client, and the firm, and on the other side you have cost, perception, and value. First, let's talk about travel expenses from your perspective. When managing travel expenses, seek to consider 6 guiding principles. Let's take a look at each guiding principle. The first guiding principle is don't spend money on things that you do not need to get the job done. The most important principle is remember, only do things that are required to get the job done. For example, you don't need to stay in a hotel. You need to sleep in a comfortable and safe place while you are working on a consulting project. But you do not need to go to a luxury spa to be able to do your job. Also, if you are doing something because it will not show up on the itemized bill, the mere fact that you do something because you know it will not show up on the bill shows that you know it is wrong. So don't do things you know or assume to be wrong. It is unethical. So to come back to this Deloitte consultant who asked a very important question, when deciding if travel expenses are reasonable, consider if it is needed to get the job done. Number 2, don't spend money on things you would not spend on by yourself. You also should not do things you would not do if you were paying for it. You cannot do things just because client is paying for it. That is just wrong. Make sure that your choices are in sync with client's culture and situation. That is when we come to the concept of perception. Be very careful about how you spend clients' money in light of client's culture and client's particular situation. For example, choose a hotel that a reasonable person will consider to be an appropriate selection for that particular client and their particular situation. For instance, if client is going through a turnaround, don't book a 5-star hotel. Also, if you are working for a client that is very reserved, then everything you do that interfaces with the client should be reserved as well. Further, while from client's perspective, they will always want you to cut consulting costs, from a client's perception level, don't do things that will clash with their culture. If you are doing things that put you out of sync with the client, that is a problem. If you are, for example, serving a major financial services client that has a certain way of doing things, which happens to be staying in 5-star hotels, and you instead stay in 2-star motel, you are doing things that are out of sync. So you see, this cuts both ways. However, you can get away with staying in a 2-star motel if that is just the way you are. There are stories of Marvin Bauer who was very frugal. In fact, he was flying coach when everyone else was flying business class. But you need to manage it and make a judgment call based on your particular situation. You can charge a lot for your work, but do not create an impression that you are abusing travel expenses. In fact, this is our philosophy. Bill very high fees, but very reasonable expenses. Never ever charge low fees to a frugal client. Number 4, make sure that your actions look congruent with your overall profile. When it comes to managing costs, if you do not feel comfortable to charge the client for the finer things your project team selects, my view is that it's okay to say, you know what, I don't need the most expensive thing. It's okay to do it. You do not need to do what other people on the team are doing. But don't make it look like you are better than anyone else. If you are someone who is frugal and likes simpler things, it's okay to go down that path versus doing what everyone else is doing. It's okay to order the cheapest thing in a restaurant. Just because you go to an expensive restaurant doesn't mean that you need to order an expensive dinner. I have been in situations where I ordered the cheapest thing on the menu just because I knew the client was paying for it. And I did not want them to waste money. Michael often has meetings in Starbucks. He even met CEOs in Starbucks. His view is that unnecessary overhead is just theft from shareholders, and consulting expenses that are not necessary is an example of unnecessary overhead. If you have decided on a personal basis to save clients' money, if it is consistent with the way you are, you will most likely not be treated badly by your project team. However, if you generally like unnecessary luxuries and you drive this expensive German convertible and you go to a team meeting in a restaurant and you order the least expensive item and you expect the rest of your team to do the same, they may take it the wrong way. They may notice a disconnect between who you are and what you are doing. And some members of your project team may think that you are trying to make them look bad. Number 5, while it is important to save money for the client, also make sure your needs are met. If you ask the client how much you should spend, they will almost always tell you to spend as little as possible. As a result, if you are making decisions based on what client considers to be right, you will almost always undercut yourself. So don't ask the client how much to spend on the hotels and meals, because they will most likely give you the cheapest option. That is what clients do. While you should try to save money for the client, you also need to meet your needs. So I would say don't cut the costs to the bone so it is detrimental to you. Building a great team is expensive. You need to do things that are sustainable. And if putting all consultants in cheap hotels forces them to leave, this is not sustainable. You have to treat consultants well, and that means relatively higher expenses. Number 6, extravagant travel expenses should translate into at least equal value for the client. If someone is a terrible consultant, they should feel horrible about racking up extravagant travel expenses, knowing full well that they deliver in very little value for the client. And if someone is a brilliant consultant, then in my opinion, it is okay to have some somewhat extravagant travel expenses as long as it is required to do the job. For example, if flying business class versus economy class means that you can get good sleep overnight and you can be productive the next day, that means better value for the client, versus if you fly economy class, you don't get any sleep and the next day you are not productive, but you're still billing the client. But what does it mean to add value to the client? Adding value to the client does not mean I'm a McKinsey consultant, I work for McKinsey, and therefore I'm adding value to the client. Just because someone is working for McKinsey doesn't mean they are adding value to the client. You are adding value when you feel you are doing things that will earn you a bonus. You add value when you do more than what is expected of you. If someone is just doing enough to complete the tasks assigned to them, earn their base salary and get promoted in the normal amount of time, that is a really poor value. If you are someone who likes finer things in life and that is reflected in your travel expenses, make sure that you adding sufficiently higher value to the client to compensate for those additional travel expenses. And if you do not feel that you are adding value beyond what is expected of you, then try to keep travel expenses to a minimum. Travel expenses decisions are often a judgment call. It comes down to this: do you feel you are adding value to the client or not? And do you require this particular expense to add an additional value? And if you believe I will add value to the client even if I don't get this particular extra things, then don't go for those extra things. If you feel, however, that you really need those finer things, then make sure that you add in additional value to the client beyond what is expected. And I know many of you are saying, well, the luxury, travel and expenses is a perk of management consulting. But this perk is a reward for bringing in talented people who will do extraordinary things. You do something extraordinary and you get a perk. A mere fact that someone is a management consultant at a firm like McKinsey, BCG doesn't mean they do anything extraordinary. Yet this is the way many consultants think. They think, well, McKinsey hired me, therefore I deserve this perk. That is wrong. If you have an extravagant taste and you get the job done, the client may hate you for spending too much money, but they will likely tolerate you while you are adding value. Like that example I gave you about the oil company. Yet remember that predominant number of clients like consultants who are good at their job and who are frugal with expenses. I have never seen a client who said, well, they have such a simple taste and therefore I will not hire them. Clients don't care about your taste, generally. Some of the most brilliant consultants look like they wearing a suit that they got from grandfather's closet, and yet clients love them. If you get the job done and you care about clients' money like it was your own, they will most likely like you a lot more than somebody who is doing a good job but is not frugal with expenses. And that is the thing you need to consider. So the bottom line is, if I was you, I would try not to spend clients' money unless it is necessary, because ultimately that is all overhead and it increases amount of value that you have to add to the client. Now let's look at this issue from the consulting firm's perspective. The consulting firm needs to hire the smartest people. It is going to be very difficult to entice the smartest people to work for the consulting firm if they can easily find another company with better perks and better work conditions. So in a truly competitive market where people are joining consulting firm partially because of the perks, it's going to be very difficult to entice people to join if you are not offering those perks. And the weaker the brand of the consulting firm, the more important the perks. When people are picking a consulting firm with a weak brand because of its perks, such consulting firm has no choice but to offer those perks. People would say McKinsey also offers those perks. That is true, but a lot of perks that McKinsey offers is not so great because they don't really have to try so hard. The brand is so strong. For example, McKinsey's salaries are not as inflated as people think. And McKinsey can get away with it because the brand is so strong. So from the consulting firm's perspective, the position is, even though we are incurring very high expenses because we are bringing in the best people, the value of the work will show through. The firm is basically looking at it from a cost-value perspective. Lastly, let's take a look at travel expenses from the client's perspective. When you apply this competitive market position from recruitment to clients, the same thinking applies. If a consulting firm offering those perks, obviously the cost to the client goes up because all that overhead will need to be eaten up. If the cost to the client goes up, in the short term they may accept it. But in the long term, unless you add enough value to that client, the client is going to say, you cost us a lot of money, you do not add enough value. Therefore, we're not going to work with you anymore. So now we come back to the value discussion. If the consulting firm does not add enough value to justify the costs, the client is completely free to walk away. This is what it means to be in a competitive market. The client is not obligated to work with any particular consulting firm. The client sees the fees, they understand that part of it is baked in travel expenses. If they are satisfied with the value versus cost trade-off, they say, this is the value the consultants brought, so we are okay with it. The value of the work is showing through. So from the client's perspective, it is also cost-value trade-off. Proper management of travel expenses on consulting projects requires good judgment. However, the 6 guidelines will help you determine whether a particular cost is appropriate to expense. Frugal consultants who add an enormous amount of value are respected. Extravagant consultants who add a significant amount of value are usually tolerated, but are likely to be pushed aside at the first sign that the value is starting to drop. So the question is, do you want to be a consultant who is liked or who is tolerated, assuming both add the same amount of value? If you are spending a lot of money, at the first sign of trouble, the client will likely push you aside. So ask yourself whether the risk is worth it after everything you invested in building your career. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed this video. Let me know in the comments if you liked it. What are your thoughts about managing travel expenses? What were some expenses that you were not sure how to handle best? And do you have any stories about difficulties in managing travel expenses? Best of luck with the rest of your day, and I'm looking forward to see you next time.